Jeremy Kyle show didn't cause or contribute to Steve Dymond's death. My conscience is clear.
For years, the Jeremy Kyle show was one of the most watched daytime programs in the UK, a tabloid-style talk show built around conflict, confrontation, and public resolution of private problems. Now, it's been 13 years since I worked on that show as a runner, and I finally feel ready to talk about what I saw behind the scenes. Not in a sensational way, but in a reflective one. Because the older that I get, the more I wonder what this kind of television did to the people who walked through those doors. So why make this video now? Well, over the last 6 months, I've been making a series about Carl Jung's Red Book. It's essentially a personal journal from one of the founders of modern psychology. And throughout it, ideas around class, status, morality, and mortality come up again and again. And it made me think of the most intense examples of those themes in my own life, which brought me back to a 2-week job that I took straight after university, working behind the scenes, running on the Jeremy Kyle show. I didn't feel completely comfortable taking the job, but I did just complete a media course next door, and a friend who was already working for ITV at the time told me that the experience in one of their studios would look good on my CV. And I'll be honest, even now it's difficult to describe what those 2 weeks did to my perception of the industry. I'm gonna try and explain this clearly because I don't want to be driven by emotion. I want the process itself to be visible and for the audience to decide what it means. So, the waiting rooms. One of the first things I noticed was how the guests were managed before they went out on stage. Guests weren't usually addressed by name, at least not in the spaces that I worked in, but by the number of the room that they were assigned to. They would arrive separately, and the purpose seemed obvious: reduce the chances of arguments or confrontations happening before the show started. Sometimes these guests arrived already intoxicated, not always, but often enough for it to stand out. When they entered the building, they went through security and personal items were confiscated, including their phones. Then they were taken to their rooms, and the rooms were strange. There was a chair facing a large mirror on the wall. You'd walk in and immediately notice it. And I remember thinking, what does it do to someone's head to sit alone in a room like that for 3 to 4 hours with no phone, no distractions, minimum contact with anyone, and with nothing but yourself to look at in the mirror? What does that do to your nervous system? There was usually a TV mounted on the wall as well, but it didn't function from what I saw. Whether it was technical, accidental, or deliberate, I can only speak from what it felt like in that environment. Another reminder that you were waiting with no control. And I kept thinking, if you're already anxious, scared, or vulnerable, how would that room amplify it? Another thing that stood out was the way the staff were expected to interact with the guests. The guests would sometimes try and leave their rooms, sometimes just to speak to someone, ask a question, or, I don't know, break the monotony of the isolation that they were in. And I remember this moment vividly, where one of the guests came out of their room and a staff member, without even looking at them, were holding their clipboard, raised their hand, referred to them by their room number, and ushered them back inside, closed the door behind them. No conversation, no reassurance, just control. And I remember thinking, what does it feel like to be spoken to like a room number, to be treated like a logistical problem instead of a person? That moment genuinely shook me. It wasn't quite Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, but it made something clear. The system required distance between the staff and the guests. At around 20 years old, I wasn't trained in mental health support, conflict management, or safeguarding. I was a runner, but I was sometimes placed in situations that felt far beyond what I was qualified to handle. One day, I was told to keep an eye on a guest who was highly distressed, pacing, crying, he was punching walls, and clearly having second thoughts about going on television in front of a live audience. And for context, this guy was huge, built like a bouncer, at least 6'4" and easily 3 times my size. And I remember thinking, what happens if this goes wrong? What happens if he hurts himself or someone else? And the person watching him, the person looking after him, is just a young runner with a headset. It raised a bigger question to me. When people are visibly struggling and having a psychotic break, what is the ethical responsibility of a production? Is the priority their well-being or the episode being delivered on schedule? Because whether intentionally or not, the structure of the day, it created pressure, and pressure creates volatility. And unfortunately, volatility was something which that live audience craved. At one point, this guest ran off as the show was about to begin. I got calls through my headset to start chasing after him, and whilst I was running around the back of the set, I had my first and only direct interaction with Jeremy. I remember raising an eyebrow at him. It was more instinct than anything else, and he scowled. And then he shoulder barged me. Now, I can't claim to know what was going through his head in that moment, but I later learned just how expensive studio time was and how much it would cost if an episode collapsed. So I wonder now if in that moment, off camera, in the chaos, frustration was just looking for somewhere to land. I remember thinking, if pressure is traveling downward through this system and the top dog is feeling the heat, what psychological state does that put everyone else in? One of the more disturbing things I witnessed on the show was just how quickly some of the producers could change their tone towards the guests. There was this young father on the show who he's trying to convince his ex-wife to allow visitation with their child. At first, the producer, she was supporting him. She was gentle, calm and encouraging. They'd even sent a runner to the Trafford Centre to make a Build-A-Bear, the idea being that the dad would present it to the child, there'd be emotion, maybe reconciliation, you know, maybe a hopeful ending. And I remember watching the producer build him up at the door before he was about to go on stage. You've got this. You can do this. Go in there and win your child back. Then intense music started. A red light flashed above the door, and it was like the producer just became a completely different person. Suddenly their language turned harsh. It was aggressive, designed to spike emotion and urgency. I'm paraphrasing because it's been 13 years, but the message was essentially, she thinks you're a deadbeat dad, you're worthless, you failed, you'll never see kid again. The doors swung open, she pushed him through it, and the thing I remember most isn't the words, it's the look on that poor young dad's face. Shock, confusion, betrayal. And it made me wonder, if someone is emotionally primed like that seconds before they go live on air, how much agency do they really have in that moment? How are they going to handle the harsh, intense lights, a loud live audience, zooming in of the cameras as adrenaline pumps through their veins? The last thing that I want to talk about is the show's lie detector tests and what it taught me about how truth gets presented on TV. While guests were waiting, they would often ask for basic things like food, water, and cigarette breaks. Runners didn't make those calls, the producers did. We'd often be told to reassure the guests that the food and water was on its way. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't, but either way, the effect was the same. The guests, well, they stayed in a state of anticipation, uncertainty, and dependence, and I kept thinking, if you're already under pressure, you're being kept waiting, you're hungry and stressed out, how does that affect your behavior? One time I was allowed to take a guest outside for a cigarette. She was a young woman who was in for a lie detector test connected to allegations of cheating. And she seemed genuinely relieved, almost happy, because she believed that these test results would clear absolutely everything up. She spoke like someone who expected to go home with her partner after this, like this entire ordeal was about to end. And I remember thinking, she really believes she's telling the truth. But later from the green room, unfortunately, I saw that the test results had come back as negative. At the time, I accepted it completely because the show treated the results as gospel. It was only later that I learned that polygraph tests aren't universally accepted as reliable, and that heightened stress can affect the results. And that detail, it stayed with me because that studio environment was not calm. It was tense. So the question became, if you create a high pressure environment and then you run a test whose accuracy can be influenced by stress, what are you actually measuring? I only worked on the show for 2 weeks. That's all I could handle. And looking back, the thing that I struggle with the most is that whole environment felt designed to intensify emotion, not reduce it. And the more intensified people became, the more dramatic that show was, which leaves me with a bigger cultural question. Why did so many of us watch it? Because it wasn't just a show, it was a national habit. And in Steve Dymond's case, the story, it ended with tragedy. There's a quote that stuck with me from Jeremy Kyle to Steve Dymond. "I wouldn't trust you with the chocolate button," which to me reads as bullying about the man's weight. It was said after it was revealed that he'd failed the lie detector test. And I think the point isn't even whether Steve was lying or telling the truth. It's why we even thought it was acceptable to turn personal breakdown into entertainment in front of an audience under judgment with a scoreboard attached. And if you've never worked in media, you might assume that scandals like this are rare, but the longer I've lived, the more I've realized that a lot stays quiet in this industry, partly because people fear being shut out of work in the future. But then you have to ask, what is your career worth if it depends on your silence? What kind of system survives because ordinary people look away? I'd like to think that we can grow as a culture, that we can look back at something like the Jeremy Kyle show and recognize it for what it was, a product of its time and a reflection of something uncomfortable in us. What I keep coming back to now isn't just the ethics of production, it's the class dynamics underneath it all. Because the show didn't pull its guests from equal parts of society. A lot of the people who ended up on the stage, they were often working class, often in financial or emotional distress. People dealing with relationship breakdowns, housing insecurity, unstable work or family conflict. And there's something important about the incentives. If you're offered travel covered, expenses covered, and a lie detector test, something that sounds official and decisive, that can feel like a genuine chance to remove a crisis, especially if you don't have money for legal support, counselling, or even the space to step away from a chaotic situation. So I wonder, if you're already struggling, how easy is it to say no to a solution that's packaged like help? And when people accept that offer, are they giving informed consent, or are they being nudged by their circumstances? Because that's the part that sits heavy with me now. Not just that people were put under pressure on camera, but that the people most likely to end up there were often the ones with the least protection. And that raises a wider question about Britain. When did we start confusing working class with fair game? When did it become normal to treat financial hardship like a character flaw? Maybe the real legacy of shows like Jeremy Kyle is that they didn't just reflect class divisions, they reinforced them. They taught audiences who to laugh at, who to judge, and who deserved empathy. And if that's true, the moral lesson isn't only about one program. It's about the kind of country we become when we turn social inequality into entertainment.